Where to start? I think when you think of the question of individual terrorism that we're discussing today, Marxism versus terrorism, we're not having this discussion in a vacuum, obviously. The background to that is the incredible events you saw in the United States last December. And, you know, what a time to be alive. Could you imagine 10 or 15 years ago, someone being shot in broad daylight, receiving such an outpouring of support? I don't think that would be the case. That would not have happened 10, 15 years ago. It expressed something deep about the world we live in today in 2024, 2025. And we talk all the time about this radicalization, this anger against the system. Well, and there's many polls about it, but there's no poll that can capture that can express as well the sentiment in the population that this outpouring of support for this killing of a CEO in broad daylight. And actually, speaking of polls, it has been quantified, the support for the alleged shooter Luigi Mangione. I think you've all seen that at the time when it happened. You know, this poll that said that 41% of Americans aged 18 to 29 considered this murder acceptable. But there were other polls, actually. One of them said that 45% of American college students sympathize more with Luigi Mangione, and 17% only sympathize with the CEO. And 48% of American college students considered the murder totally or partially justified. And these numbers don't lie. And what is also incredible is it's all the political spectrum. There's people all across the so-called left-right divide that actually support Luigi and agree and sympathize with the murder of a CEO. So this is the incredible days in which we live in, and everybody can see that yes, you know, it is about healthcare. It is about this hatred against the health companies, the private healthcare in the U.S. But obviously, it's about much more than that. And actually, there was the spokesperson. The press secretary, Democratic press secretary of the White House, which had said, she was asked on the spot, what do you think about the support for Luigi? And she said, obviously, this is horrific. Violence to combat any sort of corporate greed is unacceptable. She's involuntarily admitting that it is about corporate greed in general, which it is. And that's the point. And it does express this raw class anger that we saw in the US, and so many people can relate to this line in Luigi's manifesto. These parasites had it coming. But for us, this opens an opportunity to discuss this question in a more broad sense. Because yes, this act showed how millions hate the rich and want them to stop ruining the lives of ordinary workers. But the question is, how can we stop them? How can we really stop them for real? What are the methods that can contribute to the fight to end the suffering that these CEOs are imposing? And what if more of this happened? More acts like this shooting? What methods do we need, and what work? So I think it offers a good opportunity to review the history of the Marxist position on the question of individual terrorism. And it has, in fact, a long history in the Marxist movement, as some of you might know. But I think it's useful when discussing that to go back to the basics. Because yes, we are communists. We fight for the overthrow of the capitalist system. How? Well, history has shown that the capitalist system does create its own gravediggers. It has created an enormous working class, which alone has the power to overthrow the system. And this is not an arbitrary thing that we say. It's not because we like the workers or they're nice or good people. That's not always the case. It's because of their role in production. That through its numbers and its role, it has the power to paralyze the economy and to build a new society, to build a new socialist society, a socialist economy. And that's why the Marxists, the communists, seek to organize the working class. And that's why we pay scrupulous attention to developments in the workers' movement. And we defend anything and everything that strengthens the unity of the working class, strengthens its confidence in its own forces and its understanding of the necessity of and the effectiveness of mass struggle against capitalism. And we reject the methods that go and the ideas that go against these objectives. But the second thing to keep in mind when discussing that, which is almost as important, is that we absolutely reject the bourgeois morality that we see around us. Because, yeah, these people said, the violence is unacceptable in general. The same people that just funded a genocide. They preach, that thou shalt not kill, while perpetrating the worst violence all across the world. And it's really important to not give an inch to the hypocritical morality of the ruling class that claim that violence is unacceptable while doing the opposite every single day. And actually, I would say that the reaction to the shooting of the CEO shows that millions do reject this hypocritical morality, or are starting to reject it. It is in and of itself a progressive development and an enormous symptom of the decay of the system, that millions refuse to accept what the ruling class want us to believe. So no, we don't judge the actions of Luigi from the standpoint of abstract morality. It's from the standpoint of the interests of the working class, the interests of the fight for socialism. And that's been the position of Marxists on individual terrorism in general, all through history. And yes, there has been a long history of this question coming up in the movement, in the revolutionary movement. And obviously, the most interesting and rich example of this is the Russian revolutionary movement. And we pay scrupulous attention. We study the history of the Russian Revolution of 1917, the events after, the events before. But long before the Bolsheviks took power in 1917, the Marxists were an extreme minority in the revolutionary movement in Russia. Were non-existent, and the main force were what we call the Narodniks, which did stand for methods of individual terrorism to bring down the Tsarist state. So this is an extremely interesting historical example that I think really sheds light to this question today. You had an incredibly inspiring movement of dozens of youth giving their lives to actually fight Tsarism, and by methods of killing policemen, state officials, and eventually the Tsar himself. So I think if we look at that history, a lot of the lessons of that period are extremely illuminating for the events we see today. So I'll spend a bit of time on that. But yeah, similar to today, actually, if you look at the Russia of the mid-19th century, you find a society in a complete impasse. You have the Tsarist monarchy keeping the population in the grip of this severe repression. You have massive censorship that prevented any openly or covertly revolutionary texts of seeing the light of the day. Even some non-revolutionary novels were censored at the time. And the overwhelming majority of the population, the peasants, were mercilessly oppressed by the Tsarist regime that was surrounded by a clique of nobles and a rising bourgeois. And any attempt at liberal reform had been completely crushed. There had been some sort of uprising by military officials, liberal-minded people in 1825, completely crushed. The liberals were brutally silenced in the 1840s and the 50s. And there was a land reform in 1861, which abolished serfdom, but basically changed the chains for other chains. It replaced it basically by crushing payments on the peasants. So nothing had changed, nothing fundamental had changed. So what you see in the 1860s in particular is a young layer, the young generation of the intelligentsia that drew revolutionary socialist conclusion from this impasse. And we're talking here about people like, sons and daughters of priests, state officials, nobles that had been ruined by the reforms. Some of them were. They started to read Hegel. They started to read Feuerbach, other philosophers of that sort. The utopian socialists as well, for the European utopian socialists. And yeah, so this layer became revolutionaries. and they were looking for a way out. And in the 1870s, this revolutionary intelligentsia, they did attempt to mobilize the peasants. They could see, this multi-million mass of people, and they actually took that very seriously. They went to the people. They went, they even disguised as peasants, which seems a bit funny today. But the point was they were trying to go to the people, speak to them, and spark a revolution. And when you think about it, there's something quite inspiring to think of these young 20-year-olds dropping out of school, going to the peasants to bring about a revolution. But this did not work. The peasants were actually extremely suspicious of anything coming from the cities. So this layer of young people were completely stifled. The peasants did not move. The Tsarist state was this force that really seemed to come from the outside, crushing society. And another important factor is the working class was still a tiny force and did not represent a visible revolutionary force, at least at the time. And it was in this context that the tactic of individual terrorism found fertile ground. And I think what this one thing that it points out, that it leads to, is the class basis of individual terrorism. And that's the case in all the various epoch where this comes up. It found its basis in petty bourgeois layers of society. And we often say petit bourgeois. It's not an insult. It's not a term of abuse. It's a scientific term. We're talking about this very heterogeneous group of people that generally stand between the rising working class and the capitalist class. And there's various shades to what the petit bourgeois is. But these layers, once or if they draw revolutionary conclusions, are generally more prone to individual methods of action instead of collective struggle. And it comes with a certain impatience, not waiting or not even looking for a mass base for the struggle. And that was the case in Russia. Faced with the relative calm of the masses, this young layer of revolutionaries were looking for a shortcut to revolution and found it in these individual actions against policemen, state officials, and the rest of it. It was really this idea of doing something now, which is a psychological trait that you see again and again with some revolutionaries. And there's a very interesting example of this, which we discuss in the latest paper, in the article on this, the case of Vera Zasulich. And that is extremely interesting because the parallels with today are striking. She was actually one of these youngsters, coming from a small town, moving to St. Petersburg, being exposed to revolutionary ideas, joining a revolutionary circle in the city. And she became actually one of the most famous terrorists. It was in 1878. She basically went to this guy, Trepov, which was the governor of St. Petersburg, shouted, "Revenge!" and shot at him, just like in his face. And she was immediately arrested, obviously. She didn't kill him, though. When she was asked, why did you do this? She said, for Bogolyubov, which was another guy that had been in prison by the state. He was a political prisoner, and he had been flogged on the order of this guy, Trepov, just for refusing to remove his cap in front of him. So she was just avenging her comrade. It's as simple as that. But actually, at her trial, she explained more why she did that. And the quote is quite illuminating. She said, "I didn't see any other means. It is terrible to raise one's hand against one's fellow man, but I decided that this was what I had to do." And if you've read Luigi Mangione's manifesto, there's a line that is almost identical, where Luigi says, "I do apologize for any strife or traumas, but it had to be done. Frankly, these parasites had it coming." It's the same psychological basis. They're both basically saying, "I'm sorry, but I had to." The point I'm trying to get at is this question of the psychological basis of terrorist acts. Actually, that's something Trotsky once said. He said, "The most important psychological source of terrorism is always the feeling of revenge in search of an outlet." And that's what millions thought when they saw Luigi Mangione, that we had gotten revenge. And there's so many reasons to want revenge in this sick society that we have today under capitalism. And individual terrorism is the extreme act expressing this desire for revenge. And actually what happened is Vera Zasulich became a hero. Very similar to Mangione today. She was, she was fascinated. She fascinated Europe and America. There were articles about her. Everyone spoke about her. Even Oscar Wilde, who's a writer, the first play he wrote was about Vera Zasulich. And yeah, there were some leaflets in factories describing Zasulich as this fearless girl who did not shrink from the awful bloody deed and her own ruin when no other means remained for her defense of the rights of men. And the flyer said she had shown that the tyrants were not almighty. And the most incredible part of the story, in my opinion, is she was found not guilty, which I have my doubts that that's going to happen to Luigi Mangione. But the point is, yeah, it became a trial of Tsarism, actually. They kind of flipped the table. And it was about this torture, the political prisoners, and all the rest of it. And yeah, she became a symbol of resistance, a hero. And what happened is this did give a huge boost to the terrorist movement in Russia. Now, was that a good thing? Well, we'll see in a minute that it was not a good thing. That the wave of terrorism that came, did not overthrow Tsarism. And actually, the point is the more the movement grew, the more it was preparing its destruction. Because, in 1879, the main proponents of terrorism coalesced in the group called the Narodnaya Volia, so the Narodniks. The word Narod means people, so it was the people's will. That was the name of the group. So here we have a group that kind of systematized terrorism, believed that continuously disrupting, intimidating the regime, that would be the way to overthrow it. This was a very small movement, actually. The active layer, it was the most exact number, or at least the more precise number I found, was 37 people. It was relatively small, but it did have a big impact. But their political perspective was quite limited. There was actually a Narodnik, the leader, that explained it. It's kind of either an interview or a dialogue with someone else. And the guy said, "History moves too slowly. It needs a push. Otherwise, the whole nation will be rotten and gone to seed before the liberals get anything done." And then he's asked, "What about a constitution?" He said, "All to the good." "Well, what do you want? To work for a constitution or to give history a push?" I'm not joking. Just now, we want to give history a push. So they were kind of fighting for a liberal constitution by more extreme methods than the liberals. It's not for nothing that the Marxists would call them liberals with a bomb, which kind of express what this current meant. I might come back to this later if I have time. But yeah, in 1881, actually, the Narodniks pulled off the biggest feat imaginable because they killed the Tsar himself. What more could you ask of them? They killed the guy, which was an incredible feat. But what was the result of that? Well, the result was to usher a period of complete political reaction. Because, yeah, the successor to the Tsar, Alexander III, stopped any hint of liberal reform. His father had been a bit more lax, to put it that way. He deprived the universities of their autonomy. They even started to ban more books, the books of Spinoza, Voltaire, Hobbes. Jewish pogroms became widespread. And the terrorists were mercilessly crushed. You got 5 of them hanged for the assassination. Others were sent to prison and exile. And actually, the assassination of the Tsar was the beginning of the end for the terrorist movement. It completely destroyed it. Because also, the masses did not move. It did not arouse any revolt among the peasantry, nor among the rising working class. And in this context of complete isolation, they were completely crushed. And actually, if you want, the last peak, it was not the peak actually, it was probably the low point of the movement, was a few years later in 1887, when there was a completely botched attempt on the life of the Tsar, led by a young man called Alexander Ulyanov, which is the brother of Lenin. And he was hanged, actually, for this botched attempt with 4 other comrades. But in court, Ulyanov said the following, which I think is really interesting for the topic. He said the following. He said, "We have no strongly grouped class that could hold back the government. At the same time, our intelligentsia is physically so weak and unorganized that at present it cannot engage in open struggle. the weak intelligentsia, very dimly penetrated by the interests of the masses, can only defend its right to social thought in the form of terrorism, which I think, again, highlights the psychology behind these terrorist actions. It's a cry of despair in a situation where you either don't see or don't understand the need. You think mass action is not possible, rightly or wrongly, and that's the psychology behind terrorist actions, and that's the irony of the thing, that actually the more successful individual terrorism is, the more widespread it becomes, the more harmful are the consequences, because that's the thing. They killed the Tsar, and it only crushed the movement actually. And it did not spark a mass movement. It did not hasten the overthrow of the Tsarist regime. The only thing it did is it destroyed a generation of courageous and sincere activists. But obviously, you probably know that this experience did not pass without a trace, and the best people learned the lessons and actually moved to Marxism. Quite literally, actually, because the first Marxist group in Russia was founded by 3 people, and 2 of them were ex-Narodniks. That's Plekhanov, who's one of the most famous Marxists of that epoch, and Vera Zasulich herself, who became a Marxist and rejected openly the methods of terrorism. But it wasn't that easy, actually, because the Narodniks were few in numbers, but they had a big influence on this layer of youth looking for revolution. And they had to wage an ideological battle against terrorism. And I don't know if you know that, but even Lenin himself, for reasons I think are quite understandable, for a long while was skeptical about rejecting terrorism outright. It took him some time to really be won over to Marxism. So it was a strong tradition that had support in the youth, even though it was getting crushed. And even at the time, the Marxists were starting to argue against this. They were even a bit soft, actually, and they tried to publish the texts about Marxist philosophy, the role of the working class, and all of that. And they were accused of being not revolutionaries, but students of sociology, actually, which is a quite interesting quote, a quite interesting accusation against the Marxists of those days. Which, by the way, we're talking about very few people, a very embryonic Marxist movement. But this thing about, oh, you're not revolutionaries but sociologists, how many times have we heard that about the RCP? I've heard it many, many times. And when I joined, that's what people said. Oh, you're just a book club and we should do stuff. And this question of terrorism, actually, it is broader than just political assassination. I don't think we should narrow it to that only. Because when we talk about the psychology to do something now, you see it express itself in various ways. And one of them is these, I guess you could say, a lower level individual action to disrupt. And you see it in Montreal, there was that all the time in the past. Like in demos, you would always have a group of anarchists throw rocks at the police cars, or at the banks, or the police station, or what have you. It was a big thing, But broadly speaking, it's the same method and the same psychology, these individual actions to disrupt the regime. I remember actually one time in Montreal overhearing a conversation in a bookstore. It was the anarchist bookstore, so it was the right place to hear that. But there was 2 of them talking, and one of them was like, "Oh yeah, we have to make the police attack demos because that will show their role and discredit them in the eyes of people." So you see this idea of wanting to be a spark to a movement, but the reaction is invariably the same. It does not actually strengthen the movement or expose the police, maybe a bit, but it actually gives a pretext to the police to attack demos, to repress people. And it actually gives ammunition to the bourgeois propaganda that demonstrators are just violent thugs, etc., etc. And actually, ever since 2012 in Quebec, in which there was a lot of that, there isn't a single radical demo in Montreal where you don't have hundreds of riot cops present. And I mean, to be perfectly clear, we do absolutely reject the utter hypocrisy of these people when they attack demos and young people for being violent. There was a lot of that during the Palestine movement and the student strike day that we had. We do reject that. But that being said, the method of small groups going to throw rocks at the police is not the methods of mass action that we need. But the point is also these debates we've had, or these questions that have been raised in the movement, in Montreal or elsewhere, it's very similar, actually, the debate between individual action right now or the need to patiently build a group with clear ideas to bring to the masses. And actually, even just the idea that only the masses, the mass movement, that is the best method of struggle. So this was what we saw at the times of the birth of the Russian Marxist movement. And to their credit, they stood their ground. They built a Marxist nucleus in the Russian workers' movement. They were mostly in exile for a long while. But this also, the rise of Marxism and you could say the decline of the individual terrorist movement coincided with something else, which was the rise of the working class in Russia, which was also demonstrating in practice that the Marxist ideas were right, actually. And that's what the Marxists eventually, that was also one of the reasons Marxism planted deep roots in Russia. So yeah, the Marxists patiently argued for the need for revolutionaries to work patiently to win over the workers and not just excite them with terrorist actions, that there was no substitute to the struggle of the workers themselves. Because actually, that's what it was for the Narodniks, ultimately, a substitute to the mass struggle. Actually, I have another quote here by a Narodnik. He said the following: "Because of the arbitrary conduct and violence of the government, no activity at all is possible on behalf of the people. In consequence, for every vanguard activist, it is necessary, first and foremost, to put an end to the present system of government, and to struggle against it. There is no other means than to do it with arms in hand." So that shows the lack of confidence in the masses, that they say, oh, the government is too strong, there's no action by the people that is possible. But there was no shortcut. It would have to be a patient struggle to win over the nascent working class and mobilize it and the peasantry in a mass movement. And I think it's fair to say that history has delivered its verdict on this question. Because as the Narodnik movement died out, the small core of Marxists became the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, founded on Marxist foundations. There was the split of the Bolsheviks and Mensheviks in 1903. And the Bolshevik revolutionary wing took a decade and a half to build its forces and take power. Obviously, there's a lot more to it, but I don't have time to do it justice. But that's, I think history has rendered its verdict. And the Marxists actually won the masses, not by individual stunts or direct action, but by channeling the collective struggle of the working class towards the overthrow of the leftovers of the Tsarist regime and of capitalism itself in Russia. And to be sure, actually, the Marxists always considered the Narodniks heroes in their own right, selfless people. But the question was what methods would lead to victory and what methods would lead to bad consequences and results for the class struggle. And that's the whole point. So there's a lot more to say, but I think what I've tried to highlight here is the basis for terrorism and such individual action. It comes from this impatience, this desire for revenge when you don't see an outlet or don't want to see it or can't see it. It comes generally from this layer, petty bourgeois layer, that don't understand or cannot understand the need for mass action. One thing I would say, obviously, there's a big difference between the Narodniks and Luigi Mangione. The difference is that one was actually a political movement with certain ideas, mistaken, but Luigi Mangione is not part of a broader movement, as far as we know. And actually, I would argue that the fact that he's somewhat not politically affiliated means that anyone can identify with him. So there are differences, but the psychology and the class basis is somewhat very similar. And you saw that many times in history, that some layers go through these same methods and have to draw the same lessons painfully. And you have it here in Canada, actually. And I'm thinking, obviously, of the FLQ in Quebec, the Front de Libération du Québec. We have an excellent article on the website on this question of the October crisis of 1970. And I think it's worth going over it a bit here. Because this was actually, a period of massive radicalization of the Quebec working class in particular. There were big mobilizations, strikes, and it did coincide. It went together with the national awakening of the Quebecois people. And it's fair to say that in the 50s and 60s, the class question and the national question were deeply intertwined. And the FLQ was founded in that period in 1963. And they actually started by, small cells of the FLQ bombing mailboxes, public spaces. They even sometimes bomb workplaces in support of strikes or near the boss's office or stuff like that. And fighting, primarily, I would say, definitely the thing that brought them together was the question of Quebec independence. And some of them were socialists, some of them were less socialist, but they talked generally about liberating the Quebec working class. So not a homogeneous group by any means. But then obviously the biggest action came in 1970 in October when they kidnapped a British diplomat and more importantly kidnapped a Quebec Liberal minister of the Quebec provincial government. And it's an incredible story when you start to read about it. They actually forced them to broadcast their manifesto on Radio Canada in exchange for liberating one of the hostages. And student strikes erupted in support for the FLQ, actually. And you had 3,000 people packed in an arena chanting FLQ, FLQ. There was a mood, but it was very short-lived. Because actually the kidnappings became the perfect pretext for the federal government to crack down on the whole nationalist movement and the left. And then came the news that the Liberal minister had been killed, had died while he was kidnapped. And that was a big shock. And there's polls and anecdotal evidence that show that although the general population in Quebec rejected, actually supported the spirit of the organization's demands, like liberation and all of that, they rejected the methods, actually. But if you look at what was the logic behind these actions? Well, I'll tell you a quote that is actually from Charles Gagnon, who was in the FLQ. He then founded a Maoist group in the 70s. So he was a Marxist. He had a funny evolution, but at the time he said, the Quebec people are angry. All that is missing is the spark to ignite it. And it is precisely the role of the revolutionary vanguard, our role to light that spark. It is necessary to set fire everywhere in Quebec. We must speak words of fire, perform acts of fire, and multiply them. So again, you see this idea that the masses need a spark to enter into struggle. And this did not happen. This big stunt by the FLQ did not lead to a mass uprising of the workers. Actually, it led to a big crackdown and a temporary setback for the movement in 1970. But ironically, 2 years later, you had the Quebec Common Front, which is the biggest general strike in Quebec history. And where were the FLQ activists? In prison or exile. Nowhere to be found, nowhere to be found to help the movement. So we see the same lessons again and again repeated through history. But what does that mean? Does that mean that Marxists reject violence in general? That is not what this means. It's not what it means at all. Because, no, actually, if you pause to think about it, just for a minute, who in their right mind rejects violence in general? Seriously. Like you see a kid about to get stabbed. Do you do nothing because you don't want to be violent to the person about to do something very bad? If you're robbed in the middle of the night and beaten up, do you not do anything in return? When a slave owner beats up slaves, are they not allowed to resist? No one actually is against violence in general. Everybody understands that there's a reason why these clashes and conflicts erupt in a society like ours. And actually, the capitalists have shown again and again that they will be violent against the working class trying to change society. And the working class needs to be prepared to defend itself. And a socialist revolution would have to take steps to defend itself against the violent capitalist minority. Otherwise, you might just give up now. And actually, on this question of even individual actions, I don't have time for a lot of details, but it is also a contextual question in the sense that actually, I'll just say exactly what I mean. In the 1905 revolution in Russia, this question came up of like individual like bank robbings or individual actions. But it was different because it was part of a mass movement that was already happening and actions to help and assist the movement. And you also had, political killings during the Russian Civil War, for example. But that was different. It was a mass struggle on mass scale with no holds barred on any side. So obviously that's very different. But on the question of violence, our view has nothing to do with the worthless morality, the hypocritical morality of the ruling class. And we should obviously understand that the real terrorism, the real violence, comes from the state in all its various forms. And we do reject the bourgeois morality of the ruling class, but we adopt a class morality. And that's how we look at the question of violence, the question of tactics in general, actually. And all questions. We look at it from the angle of what benefits the class struggle and strengthens the working class. This is our yardstick to judge individual terrorism and other things. So yes, we are on the side of the millions of people that saw in Luigi Mangione an act that expressed their anger. But that being said, I think it's quite obvious when you think about it that this is not how you end capitalism or the violence that CEO impose in all sorts of ways. Actually, there were some news stories that came out. The CEO died, and United Health is still this crooked, corrupt, disgusting company. Actually, there was a story I was reading in the Guardian where they apparently called a surgeon during the surgery of a woman that had cancer to ask if she really needed the surgery. This is the stuff. This is not about individuals. And actually, we're not talking about, when we talk about the capitalist system, it is not based on crooked individuals. There's a lot of them, but it's based on a class. And a class doesn't disappear one individual at a time. That is not how you overthrow the power of a ruling class. And Luigi Mangione was not part of a Narodnik type movement, as far as we know. But we can think of, if these acts were multiplied, which is possible, by the way, you could have copycat actions of the sort. If it was multiplied, I don't think we would see the same reaction. Actually, the more you would have it, the more you would have a rise in state repression, similar to what you saw over 100 years ago. As I said, the more individual terrorism works, quote unquote, the more counterproductive it is. The more it invites state repression without getting anything in return. And this has been the case anywhere that individual terrorism has taken a massive scale. The individual assassinated is just replaced, and the system generally stays the same. So, and there's another more, broader point about individual terrorism. It's related to the question of the working class and the masses, that while terrorism sometimes enjoy the passive support of a majority or many people, it belittles the role of the masses. What conclusion do you draw from a successful terrorist act? That strikes are not necessary, that mass mobilization is not necessary. And that is something you see time and time again. Actually, there's a very interesting article we have on the website called Palestine on the Tactics of the Intifada, which I recommend comrades to read. It was a Palestine group that wrote to us and talking about the struggle. It was in the second Intifada, and talking about how they had no choice but to perform these acts of bombings inside Israel and all of that. And the editorial board of Marxist.com replied, and the reply is very interesting. I really recommend comrades read it. But there's this part about that talks about Marx's view on terrorism. I didn't have time to really talk about that, but that question also came up in the days of Marx and Engels. Namely, that was the movement of the Fenians in Ireland. The Fenians were, if you want, definitely the most courageous, selfless, and radical wing of the Irish liberation movement. And actually, a lot of them were made political prisoners, and one of their methods was these bombings, which they performed. And actually, the First International, they did have a campaign to defend the Irish political prisoners. But that being said, Marx and Engels were extremely critical of the actions, the methods of the Fenians. Actually, there's this exchange of letters between Marx and Engels where the Fenians had bombed, where was it? Doesn't matter, it was in London. They bombed the place, and there was 120 people wounded, and a big anti-Irish mood developed. And Marx said the following. He said, "The last exploits of the Fenians in Clerkenwell was a very stupid thing. The London masses who have shown great sympathy for Ireland will be made wild by it and driven into the arms of the government party. There is always a kind of fatality... One cannot expect the London proletariat to allow themselves to be blown up in honor of the Fenian emissaries. there is always a kind of fatality about such a secret, melodramatic sort of conspiracy. And Engels responded to Marx a few days later. He said, "The stupid affair in Clerkenwell was obviously the work of a few specialized fanatics. It is the misfortune of all conspiracies that they lead to such stupidities, because after all, something must happen. After all, something must be done." So you see the same question and the same general position, that we don't judge these acts from the standpoint of abstract morality. And Marx and Engels defended the Fenians, but we judge them from the point of view of what benefits the class struggle. And that's the whole point. Now, actually, just back to the FLQ for 1 second. There was actually a very interesting observation made by Jean-Marc Piot. He was a Marxist academic who became not very Marxist at the end of his life, but he was there in 1970, and he compared the FLQ and the October Crisis to May 68 in France. And he said the following in his diary. He said, in May, in France, students, intellectuals, and workers gradually mobilized against the bourgeois state. When the repression fell upon them, they were ready to face it, as they had been active during this offensive period. Here, in Quebec, students and leftist circles were applauding a show put on by others than themselves, that is, by the FLQ. At this level, the beginning of the walkout, the student walkout, showed sympathy for the front, but not an active movement against the state. The FLQ wants to fight for the workers, but it is absolutely unable to work with them to mobilize and organize them. So I think that's the whole point. And actually, the repression that comes down after terrorist acts fall down on the whole working class. So for all these reasons, that is why communists do not adopt these tactics. So not for any moral or sentimental reason. There was another case, actually, which is actually Lenin wrote a lot about these questions when he talked about the Narodniks. But it was another case that happened during the First World War, which was the case of Friedrich Adler. He was a member of the Social Democratic Party in Austria. And during the war, actually out of despair, he performed a terrorist act. I think he killed a minister. I might be wrong, but he killed someone important. And he was a Marxist, or at least he said he was a Marxist. So, and actually Lenin wrote a really interesting letter to an Austrian comrade about this. And he said the following. He said, "We are not at all opposed to political killing. But as revolutionary tactics, individual attacks are inexpedient and harmful. Only the mass movement can be considered genuine political struggle." And then he talks about the revolution of 1905 and how this was a mass movement that followed this period of terrorism. And actually the Narodniks were nowhere to be seen in the 1905 revolution. And Lenin talks about, he asked his comrade, tell us also, please, how right it would be to regard Adler's act as a gesture of despair. I think that politically it is so. He had lost his faith in the party. He could not bear the fact that it was impossible to work with this party. So basically he's saying that he was this desperate about the sorry state of the Social Democratic Party, which had by then supported the war, and he was not ready to do the patient work of building a Marxist opposition to the party that had betrayed the revolution. So Lenin makes the case in this letter that Adler, he says somewhere, Adler would have been a lot more useful if instead of doing this terrorist act, he would have patiently built a Marxist opposition within the working class movement in Austria. So again, this question has come up many times in the movement. I don't know if there will be other acts of the sort today, but I think it's very possible. Because actually, when you look at it, who can blame young people for feeling that we're in a blind alley? You think of these Russian revolutionaries of 1860, 1870s. Imagine, there's hardly any working class. The peasants are not moving. What are you supposed to do? It's not surprising that these ideas develop of individual action to kind of intimidate the regime and get revenge, But you look at today, that's the contradiction. You have an enormous working class, the biggest in history, which is led by donkeys, by union leaders that don't want to fight, that don't want to overthrow capitalism, and that do everything to prevent it. So it's understandable that the layer doesn't see a way out. But that's where we come in, because we understand that there is this enormous potential in the working class to be channeled towards a mass movement that can actually get us real revenge. Because what is revenge for Marxists? The real revenge is to overthrow the capitalist system once and for all, which cannot be done. It's cannot be done just by individual actions. It's a long struggle. Marxism, we understand, is a long view of history. I have no idea how long it will take, but the whole point is to make it as short as possible, to bring this revolution as quickly as possible, which can only be done by building a mass communist party as quick as we can, to find these people out there and actually save some of these people from this desperation and these actions, and build them into communists that can bring these ideas to the mass of the working class. And that's the role that we have today. And there's so many young people that are so angry, and right to be so. And I hope we are angry too. The system is so sick, so despicable, but we need to channel it with towards the methods that can win. And I'll just end with this quote by Trotsky, where he says, "If we oppose terrorist acts, it is only because individual revenge does not satisfy us. The account we have to settle with the capitalist system is too great to be presented to some functionary called a minister. To learn to see all the crimes against humanity, all the indignities to which the human body and spirit are subjected, as the twisted outgrowth and expression of the existing social system, in order to direct all our energies into a collective struggle against the system, that is the direction in which the burning desire for revenge can find its highest moral satisfaction." So yes, we need to cultivate this feeling of anger and revenge, but channel it towards this collective struggle. That's how we will win. And I'm incredibly optimistic we can achieve this if we get to work.